Welcome to the PlantFit Summit, bringing you the best in plant-based health and fitness. This is Luke and Toby, and today we have Peter Hammarstedt. Peter is the Director of Campaigns for Sea Shepherd Global, Captain of the Bob Barker, and he has spent more than 17 years at sea. We start the conversation with Peter sharing about why he initially joined the Sea Shepherd and became a conservationist. Enjoy the presentation.
I was a 14-year-old kid. I saw a picture of a dead minke whale being pulled up the slipway of this 8,000-ton factory whaling ship down in the Antarctic. And that image just shocked me to the core. I could not believe that whales were still being killed in our time. I thought whales had been saved by the Save the Whales movement in the 70s and 80s. I knew that whaling had been outlawed. So to know that it was still going on, and not only was it happening, but it was happening in contravention of the law, it was happening in a designated whale sanctuary, just shocked me to the core. At the time, Sea Shepherd was preparing a vessel to go to Iceland to use direct action to confront the whalers, to measure success by the number of whales that could be saved. And that's what I wanted to be a part of. I wanted to be a member of that crew, and I submitted an application to Sea Shepherd as soon as I was old enough to join.
And so you said direct action. What do you mean by direct action?
Well, for me, direct action means direct intervention. It means directly getting involved in a situation to stop that abuse from happening right then and there. If I see a person kicking a dog on the street, I'm not going to start a petition online to get people to sign a petition saying, somebody please stop this person from kicking this dog. I'm not going to start a Facebook group about it, Citizens United to stop this person kicking a dog. I'm not necessarily even going to call the police and wait for the police to show up 15 minutes later, 20 minutes later, an hour later. I'm going to stop that abuse from taking place right then and there. I'm going to take that dog out of that person's hands and make sure that they don't touch that dog again. And if that's how I would react in that situation, well, if somebody's about to harpoon a whale illegally, if somebody's about to fish down in the Antarctic in violation of international convention, then I'm not going to hang a banner. I'm not going to do a protest. I'm going to put my ship exactly where it needs to be to stop that crime, to stop that abuse from taking place. So for me, it's about being ethically consistent. And it's all about what Edmund Burke said, where evil prevails only when good people stand by and do nothing. And I've always wanted to do something.
Well, that's incredibly brave, Peter. At 14 years old, I remember when I was 14, I was just still playing, computer games, and there you were, really joining the fleet. You were in Greenpeace first, and then you moved to Sea Shepherd. What happened?
I volunteered with Greenpeace for a couple of years before I joined Sea Shepherd, and one of the reasons for that is when Iceland resumed their whaling operations back in 2003, both Greenpeace and Sea Shepherd were planning campaigns to stop whaling in Iceland. Greenpeace was planning a campaign where they were going to do a tour of the island of Iceland, visiting different ports and trying to change hearts and minds. And Sea Shepherd was preparing a campaign to directly intervene. And Sea Shepherd didn't really care about public opinion at that time. It was all about representing our clients, the whales, to the best of our abilities. We didn't really care what people thought about our actions. And when I was 18, that appealed to me a lot more, to be able to directly intervene.
When did you guys go to Japan? Because I remember you sharing the story about the Nishimaru. So how much later was that?
So that was a few years later that we went down to the Antarctic to directly intervene in the killing of whales down in the Southern Ocean by basically a government-sponsored whaling operation sponsored by the government of Japan. My first campaign that I did, however, was down in the Galapagos Islands. I joined Sea Shepherd to go to Iceland. We were delayed in port for about 5 months because of mechanical problems, and by the time we were ready to set sail, the whaling season in Iceland was already over. So the first campaign I did was down in Galapagos, in the Galapagos Islands, where Charles Darwin himself came with his theory of evolution. This is a place that's a designated marine reserve. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and yet poachers were coming in every single night, killing sharks for their fins. So we went down there to patrol, and the first action that I ever partook in with Sea Shepherd was actually physically confiscating an illegal long line set for sharks and pulling that long line out of the water.
Were you guys actually faced with a lot of resistance? Like, how were they kind of keeping you guys away?
In the Galapagos Islands, we just came across this long line set in the ocean. There's enough long lines set every single night to go around and wrap around the world 500 times. These are lines that can be hundreds of miles long, sporting thousands of hooks that are essentially indiscriminate. They're targeting sharks, but essentially they're also going to catch sea turtles, albatross, dolphins, and other fish that they're not predominantly targeting. So this is essentially a weapon of mass destruction to the oceans in terms of it not being able to discriminate between species. When we came across this long line, there weren't any poachers around. We spent 8 hours pulling this long line out of the sea. And I remember it so well because it was my first action, and because I joined Sea Shepherd with this youthful naivety that I was setting sail to save the world. I felt, okay, well, here we are pulling up 8 miles of line, and yet there's enough line to go around the world 500 times. How can this possibly make a difference? But as the minutes went by and each new hook was pulled out of the sea, and I could hold one of these hooks in my hand before throwing it into the bucket next to where I was standing on the deck, this bucket of hooks we were confiscating, I could hold one of these hooks in my hand, and as it just reflected the moonlight as we were working throughout the night, I could look at it and think, okay, well, I can't save the entire world, but I can certainly save the entire world for one of these individuals, one of these individual animals. And because a small group of passionate and compassionate people decided to intervene, that particular hook wasn't going to kill a shark or a sea turtle or a tuna or an albatross that particular night. And to think that that doesn't make a difference is incredibly anthropocentric, because it made all the difference in the world for this one particular creature.
During that time when you're out at sea as a teenager, were there any like extremely terrifying moments and encounters?
When we were tackling the Japanese whaling fleet down in the Antarctic, we were directly intervening to shut down their illegal whaling operations. And that involved blocking their operations physically, getting in the way with our ships. I remember one year in particular, we had the great fortune of being able to find the refueling tanker that belonged to the whaling fleet. Because they would spend 4 months down in the Antarctic, they had to refuel 2 or 3 times during the course of the season. And so the strategy was that if we could prevent the whaling fleet from refueling at sea, then they would be forced to go home early. We would shut down their whaling season early. Ultimately, once we found this refueling tanker, this big 8,000-ton factory whaling ship, this vessel that had haunted my nightmares since I was a 14-year-old kid and first saw a picture of it killing a minke whale, they tried to refuel. And I essentially had to use my vessel, the Bob Barker, to double park the refueling tanker, essentially taking up the position that the Nishin Maru, this 8,000-ton ship, would have taken instead. And then I had to call them on the radio, my 500 tons to their 8,000 tons, and tell them if they wanted to refuel, they would have to sink my vessel to do it. We fought over this position for about 5 days. Ultimately, my ship was rammed several times. They weren't able to refuel in the end, and we forced them to stop whaling. And ultimately, that was a year where out of a bogus self-allocated quota of 1,035 whales, the Japanese whaling fleet only took 103. So we saved 932 whales that year. And that was a tremendous victory. That's 932 whales that are swimming free in the Southern Ocean right now because we intervened.
I actually saw the pictures of the video of you guys being sandwiched in between, and it's not just a few hours, but for 5 days, and they were just kind of just hitting, and you were just kind of bouncing back and forth. And did the ship actually encounter any damage, or where you were fearing that it could potentially sink?
I remember being on the bridge at the helm, keeping the vessel in place, and I was so focused on what I was doing that I barely noticed when this 5-story tall vessel made contact with the stern of my ship, the back of my ship, and started pushing us and trying to just, like a bumper car, push us out of the way. And I remember my second mate at the time from France, Una, who's always so calm and collected. At some point, she said the words "uh-oh," and so I looked over to the starboard side, to my right, to where she was standing, and that's when I noticed the anchor of this big factory whaling ship, like a wrecking ball, right outside the window of my wheelhouse, about a meter off, ready to almost take out the entire wheelhouse. And I could hear from the bridge the crumbling of some of these communication masts that we had just above us as the frayed prow of the vessel just overshadowed us. What I had was incredible confidence knowing that out of the 30 crew on board the ship, all 30 crew were willing to do this. We had another two vessels down in the Antarctic. My crew were given the opportunity to move over to one of these other ships to, if they weren't willing to be part of this confrontation. And out of 30 crew, all 30 stayed. And I stayed, and I held my ground because my crew held their ground. So it speaks very much to their courage and the courage of Sea Shepherd volunteers.
Well, yeah, which are all over the world right now. So it's incredible work that you guys do. And I mean, Emily, my wife, actually has a Sea Shepherd shirt as well. She parades it around, and we're proud to represent what you guys do because it's incredibly dangerous work, but incredibly important and courageous work as well. So thank you for putting yourself out there and for really making a difference in the oceans, which just seem, when we're on land, we talk about factory farming and eating meat, it just seems so distant. And with that in mind, why is it the case where, where fish are concerned, it just seems like, oh yeah, fish are just fish. There's pescatarians, people who might eat fish once a week. They don't really think much about fish, but especially where the vegan or plant-based movement is going, people talk about cows and chickens. Why is that?
Well, Sir Paul McCartney said that if slaughterhouses had glass walls, then everybody would be vegetarian or vegan. And so imagine now that these slaughterhouses are tens or hundreds or even thousands of miles offshore, accessible only by boat. The slaughter takes place under the surface of the ocean. I mean, most people don't know what's happening at sea. The oceans really are out of sight and out of mind for most people. I think pescatarian is a crazy term because we don't have words for people who are vegetarian in every aspect of their life except that they still eat cows, or people who are vegan in every aspect of their life except that they still eat chicken. And yet we have this word for people who continue to eat fish, and they fall into this different category. And it's especially not rational when you consider that twice as many fish are killed every single year as all other animals on land combined. It's over 1 trillion fish are killed every single year. And not only that, but they're stabbed to death. They suffocate to death. They're frozen to death. At times they're thrown into a fish hold and they die because they're crushed by the weight of other fish being thrown on top of them. In my opinion, the slaughter is in some ways more cruel than what we do to animals on land. It's more wasteful in its wanton destructiveness. We have bycatch in the global fisheries where you're targeting one species, but you're killing a number of other species in the meanwhile because they're not your target catch and they're just thrown overboard dead. I think with fish, there's a number of reasons why people don't really give them ethical consideration. Even in the vegan movement, they always kind of end up on the last page of our vegan outreach materials. They're sort of a footnote or an afterthought. It's like, oh yeah, we've got to remember to include fish in our discourse. But one, fish don't have vocal cords. They breathe underwater through their gills, and so when we emit sound, we do so because air passes from our lungs through our vocal cords, and as it does with other mammals. But fish don't. Their screams are silent, even though they can feel pain as we do. One reason that we might not really give them ethical consideration is that they don't have eyelids and eyelashes. They don't blink, which seems like a really crazy reason to not give ethical consideration for another living creature. But when you look at mammals or other people, so much of our expression is in our eyelids and eyebrows. And when Disney Pixar was making the movie Finding Nemo, they hired the best animal behavioralists, the best marine biologists to make these cartoons as realistic as possible. That's why Nemo's father is very protective of him, because that's how clownfish are in the oceans. But the one difference between the fish in Finding Nemo and the fish in the real world is that the fish in Finding Nemo have eyelids and they blink and fish don't. And so not only are their screams silent, but when you pull them out of the water, they are staring at you expressionless. And yet there is incredible intelligence there behind these unblinking eyes. And then I think lastly, there's we know as vegans that language is used to justify slaughter all of the time. That's why people don't buy cow at the supermarket. They buy steak or ground beef. They don't buy pig, they buy pork. And with fish, I think the fishing industry has become an expert in using language to justify slaughter. So we don't talk about fish in terms of population. We talk about them in terms of stock, as if they were taken off a shelf in a warehouse. We don't talk about fish in terms of the number of fish that are killed every year. We always talk about them in terms of weight. We talk about tons of fish that are killed. And we actually don't even say that fish have been hooked or harpooned or netted. We always say that they've been harvested as if they were apples being picked off a tree in an orchard. So in one sentence, we can say that 100 ton of fish stock was harvested. So it's no small wonder why there's this huge disconnect between people and the fish that they eat.
You said 100 tons. I mean, maybe, and you shared 1 trillion fish. My goodness. I mean, we talk about more than 100 billion land animals are killed, but 1 trillion, that is astronomical. So maybe you could give us an idea, like with commercial fishing vessels, do they have like a little bit of a quota? And based on your knowledge, how many commercial fishing vessels there are, and how many tons of fish? And I understand that beyond commercial fishing vessels, there's also illegal fishing vessels. So we're really overfishing our oceans. Maybe you could share a little bit more on that aspect.
I think it's useful to look at the state of the oceans as they are now. So the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization say that 90% of the world's fisheries are either fully exploited or overexploited. Now, if you look at fully exploited as a term, we're already looking at the world's fish and biodiversity in the oceans from a state of diminishment. There's a famous fisheries scientist named Daniel Pauly who talks about a theory called shifting baseline. And shifting baseline means that your opinion and my opinion of what is a bountiful sea is very different from the opinion of our parents or their parents or the parents before them. There are accounts from the 1700s of vessels coming into Newfoundland in North America where the cod is so prevalent that you could literally walk across the backs of cod from ship to shore. You could throw a bucket overboard and pull that bucket up and it would be teeming with cod. Our idea, like we look at these stories and we think they're fantastical because we can't imagine that quantity of fish being in the oceans. And yet there's enough of these accounts that they're not apocryphal. There is enough data there to suggest that these were probably truthful accounts, maybe exaggerated a little bit, but largely truthful. Ships used to have to stop at sea for maybe up to 24 hours as pods of whales passed their bow. I mean, now we get excited when we see one whale sighting. So we can't even begin to fathom how bountiful the oceans would be if we stepped away from exploiting them entirely. So we're already looking at, when we talk about, okay, well, this fish population is being exploited sustainably. We're already looking at it from a diminished state, right? It's nowhere near what it once was. We're already looking at it from an unhealthy status. Now, if we're looking at how fisheries are managed, it's really country by country. And then there are these international forums for regulating fisheries as well. But some countries issue quotas. Some have what are known as a total allowable catch, which is really just an economic term. You can catch up to a certain amount for a certain amount of money. And then if you catch above that, then you have to pay extra for each ton above. Usually there isn't a lot of scientific data as to how much fish there is, right? So you're kind of going after what you fished the year previous. If you could catch the same amount of fish one year as you did the year previous, then you assume that this is then sustainable. But so much of it is really conjecture. And what we know for sure is that what we have today is nowhere near what we used to have. And when we look at establishing national parks on land and we look at marine reserves at sea, I mean, you can't even compare the two. It's less than 1% of the world's oceans that's actually a no-take zone where you can't fish at all.
So speaking of no-take zones, and I know of many whale sanctuaries, going back to the whales, what has the impact been for whale population since the Sea Shepherd has come to do the work that you do?
Professor Calum Roberts, he described whaling as the first real global fishing industry. So in the 1700s, whalers from the Americas, and the 1800s, whalers from the Americas and the Basque Country and the Netherlands systematically moved from ocean to ocean, driving whale species almost to the brink of extinction. And then with the dawn of steam technology and then diesel technology, and then with the advent of the explosive tipped whaling harpoon, they chased whales all the way down to the bottom of the world, down to the Southern Ocean. And so close were we to losing the great whales that in the 1980s, the international community got together and put in place a global moratorium on commercial whaling, whereby since 1986, it's been illegal to conduct commercial whaling. And that's resulted in whale populations recovering. Some whale populations, like blue whales, have like a blue whale will have one calf every 5 or 6 years. So they've been very, very slow to recover. They've hardly recovered at all. But other whale species really have started to rebound, but slowly. There's now a number of other threats facing them, though, right? It's not just commercial fishing or commercial whaling. It's now also climate change, it's ship strikes, it's pollution, it's all kinds of other threats that they're also faced with now. So we are seeing them recover, but we're also seeing other threats to them. Meanwhile, if we look at what's happening with sharks, shark populations are plummeting. We look at what's happening with sea turtle populations are going down. So while whales are having a bit of a comeback, other species are just falling rapidly. And that's largely due to commercial industrial fishing. And that's why we have to look at bycatch. So I spent 10 years chasing Japanese whaling ships down in the Antarctic, and I'm incredibly proud that in those 10 years we saved over 6,000 whales. But the reality is that 300,000 whales and dolphins are being killed every single year as bycatch to the industrial fisheries, being entangled in fishing gear that wasn't meant for them.
300,000, and that's crazy how
Yeah.
many of these species and how many of the dolphins.
I think it's interesting because when a lot of people make the jump from vegan or vegetarian to vegan, when they see the connection between the dairy industry and the meat industry, right? That these depend on one another, that the male calves from the dairy industry go to the meat market. So if you are drinking milk, even if you're not eating meat, you're still contributing to the meat industry. And most people, at least in the West, would not want to eat whale meat, right? In countries like Iceland and Norway, they do eat whale meat. In Japan, they eat whale meat. But in most of Western Europe, where I live, they don't. But by buying canned tuna, for example, they are contributing to an economic model of fishing where it's inconceivable that whales and dolphins are not caught in their gear, and they are essentially sponsoring the death of whales and sea turtles and other species that they would never really want to kill directly. So if they're contributing to that market, they are killing other species, and bycatch is a huge, huge problem.
Moving from bycatch as well, I know dolphins are being killed every single year in Tai Chi. Maybe you could share a little bit about that, because I remember watching the Cove documentary and I was just horrified. And I thought that was then, and apparently that still goes on now, doesn't it?
It does. It's between 1,000 to 2,000 dolphins that are killed every single year in this cove in Taiji, Japan, where these dolphins are driven into a shallow bay. The entrance to the bay is netted off. A number of these dolphins that are in good condition, so to speak, are taken aside and are sold for captivity, for dolphin shows. And the rest of the dolphins that don't have that market value are slaughtered wholesale for meat and the sale of meat. It's a horrible, horrific thing. Creates lots of stress and suffering for these creatures, and is ultimately driven by the aquarium trade for dolphin shows. If it wasn't for that, then it probably wouldn't be financially conceivable to do the drive hunt at all. And what's been interesting to me, I think, is we see so many people again, in Western Europe, because that's where I live, who are outraged by the dolphin drive hunt in Taiji and are disgusted by it and want to see it stopped. And again, although it's horrific what's happening in Taiji and 1,000 to 2,000 dolphins are killed every year, I again have to revert to the statistic that 300,000, 3 times as many dolphins or whales are being killed because of bycatch in the industrial fishery.
Fishing and bycatch. What about, you mentioned sustainable fish, because I remember when I visited US, went to Whole Foods, and you have a section where you can buy sustainably caught fish. What's your take on the whole kind of sustainable? Well, obviously there's also sustainable meat. So what's your take on that?
My question would be, how do you measure sustainability? There's so many metrics to it, right? Is it maybe you could exploit a certain population of tuna off of a certain country, and maybe it would be such a small amount of tuna that you're taking that the population would grow, maybe. But then you're burning 5 tons of fuel a day on this big 60, 70 meter purse seine fishing vessel that's going from Europe down to West Africa to catch fish that are then going to be canned in West Africa, shipped back to Europe for, I mean, is that sustainable? The carbon footprint is crazy. You've got to also look at the impact on other species. What's generally held up as being kind of an example of where sustainable fishing could potentially work is in the Maldives, where people are doing pole and line fishing for tuna, where you've got 20 or 30 people on the back of the boat and they're just catching tuna one by one on pole and line after they chum the water to attract the tuna with bait fish. And with that type of fishing, you can say that it's almost no bycatch at all. You're not catching sharks in the way that you are with purse seine fishing, with long line fishing. You're not destroying the sea bottom like you do with bottom trawling with huge amounts of bycatch. You can say, yes, you're largely catching tuna. But then there's another side to that argument where bait fish populations have gone down dramatically in the Maldives because people are catching bait fish to be able to chum the water to catch the tuna, quote unquote, sustainably, right? So what could be sustainable for the tuna is not sustainable for other species. So we're looking at really complex relationships in these ecosystems where if you remove any species from the equation, you're going to be affecting everything else. And that's why I think it's really hard to say what's sustainable or not. Certainly if it has a sustainable label, on the supermarket, you've got to question it. That fish has exchanged hands so many times, and we're looking at a global market where 1 out of 5 fish that's caught is caught illegally, and they're entering the market through legal means. We've got sorry, not entering through legal means, but they're on the market legally to sell. People, you can obscure where it's coming from. It's easier to launder fish than it is to launder money. 1 out of 3 fish that's imported into the United States has been caught illegally. So if you're looking at this, there's this huge black market for fish, then how is it really sustainable?
So maybe we could go into the illegal fishing industry. Obviously, we've got the commercial fishing industry who have their quotas, or they hit a certain tonnage, they need to pay more. But what's the impact on these illegal fishing boats?
We often talk about what's called illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, or what we call IUU fishing. Unreported fishing is what you would generally equate with these legal fishing boats. These are vessels that have a license to fish somewhere, but they're unreporting fish they're catching. They're misreporting what they're catching. They're maybe not reporting bycatch, so they're not reporting back that incredible amounts of sharks are being killed as they're fishing for tuna. That would be the unreported fishing side, which is also a crime. Illegal fishing is fishing using prohibited fishing gear. So there's since 1992, there's been a ban on drift nets, these invisible curtains of death. Drift nets over 2.5 kilometers long are not allowed. But a vessel that's fishing illegally wouldn't care about those regulations. They'll use drift nets that are maybe 60 miles long or more. They could be fishing in prohibited areas, marine reserves, or areas that are reserved for artisanal fishermen. That's illegal. Or they could be fishing without a license at all. And that is a huge part of the black market. It's, again, 20% of the global catch of fish is caught through IUU fishing. And in places like West Africa, where we've been doing a lot of our work, that number is closer to 40 to 50%.
Wow, 40 to 50% in West Africa. So I remember watching a documentary a while back on dynamite fishing. Do people still do that?
They do. Dynamite fishing is still a problem. Cyanide fishing is a problem. What we've seen in countries that have actually decided to take these problems seriously, like Tanzania in East Africa, where we did work, we've been working for a couple of years now, because the police put in the resources that were necessary to stop dynamite fishing, they reduced it by like 90%. What the Tanzanian police was able to do so well is connect illegal fishing with other transnational organized crime. The people who were selling explosives to these illegal fishermen who were using them to blow up reefs were also selling explosives to Al Shabaab, the terrorist group in southern Somalia. And we see that all of the time with illegal fishing. If you're the kind of operator who isn't going to pay for your license, then you're also not going to be paying tax and customs duties on what you're catching. Why would you treat your crew well? You're not going to pay them reasonably. You're going to be involved in all kinds of other criminal enterprises, and that's why since a few years ago now, the Office on Drug Crimes in the United Nations has actually declared illegal fishing as transnational organized crime. And that's where what we have to start looking at. We have to start treating them as criminals. It blows my mind that if I were to rob a bank here in Stockholm, Sweden, the money that I stole from that bank would be insured by the government, right? The people who have their money banked there, they don't lose any money. The bank is covered by insurance. Of course, the people in the bank are going to be traumatized by this event, but the people who have their money in the bank, they aren't going to be directly affected. And I'll be arrested, and if I'm convicted, I'll go to prison. In Sweden, it will be maybe 6 years. In the United States, it would probably be 20 years or 30 years. If I buy a trawler and I outfit it with fishing gear and I go to a country like the Gambia, a country in West Africa with a population of 2 million people, 200,000 of that population depend on the local artisanal fishery for their livelihoods, and it's a poor country. And I then go and I go into the area that's reserved for these artisanal fishermen. I run over their nets, which is these small nets that is their livelihood. I maybe run over their canoes and capsize them. Local artisanal fishing is like the most dangerous job in the world, in terms of deaths at sea. Fishing is the most dangerous profession in the world. Local artisanal fishermen is the most dangerous of the dangerous profession. If I then steal fish from this area, and I don't really like to say steal fish because then I'm seeing fish as being an object, but just if we follow the argument, I steal from their ability to feed themselves and to take care of their communities, and I get caught for that, I'm paying a fine of like $20,000 or $30,000, $50,000 for fishing without a license. And that's crazy because the amount of victims from that crime far exceeds robbing a bank. So we have to look at these things differently, and we see it. This is the reason why the trade in wildlife internationally, the amount of money to be made by it has far transcended what's made through narcotics and firearms, because the punishments just don't match the crime. If I'm moving, if I'm a criminal syndicate that's involved in moving ivory into Southeast Asia, if I get caught in Singapore, I'll get a prison sentence of maybe 6 or 8 years. But if I'm moving narcotics into Singapore, I'll get the death penalty. But the amount of money that's in 1 kilo of ivory is actually more than cocaine. So a lot of these criminal syndicates are moving to wildlife. But it's the same syndicates.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? And that's why I was sharing with you. I chatted with Damien Manda just to know what's actually happening up in Africa with poaching. And fortunately, with his task force, its activity has dropped significantly with his brand new Akashinga documentary that's coming out, which is going to be incredibly inspiring as well. So I want to go into what you shared about, these poorer nations and communities where they're maybe fish for subsistence. And you shared something that I found very fascinating in the documentary, Let Us Be Heroes. And you talked about Noam Chomsky sharing about the transfer of food from the needy to the greedy. Could you maybe expand a little bit on that?
As a vegan coming from the West, from an industrialized country like Sweden, like I don't equate fish with food, right? But I recognize my privilege there. And while I see that 100% of Swedish people could quickly adapt to a vegan diet, I realize that in places like Liberia and small communities there, that's not possible. We're looking at a different thing. We can't export all of our ideas everywhere. They don't have the same universality. And a poor country, I think, has to reach a certain stage of development to be able to maybe consider some of these ideas. If local fishing communities like Robertsport in Liberia, people there can't not eat fish and instead go to the supermarket and buy tofu, right? So I recognize that. Um, what's crazy is that we've got these countries that they have protection over their sovereign waters, but their resources are stretched to such a degree that they don't have the resources where they can adequately patrol and monitor the entirety of their waters. I mentioned earlier that 90% of the world's fisheries are fully exploited or overexploited. Well, added to that, 90% of the world's fish is actually caught in the waters of a country. And that's because you can't just go out to sea and find fish anywhere. Fish congregate around coastlines and continental shelves and seamounts and places like that. So that means that 90% of the world's fish is caught in the waters of a country. If you then consider also that 1 out of 5 fish is caught illegally, then we actually have the recipe here for being able to stop overfishing. I mean, this illegal fishing is largely happening in the waters of countries where it's against the law, where there's a government with the authority to actually enforce the law. So for the past 4 years, we've been signing what are known as shipwriter agreements with a number of developing African countries, from Liberia to the Gambia, Benin, Sao Tome and Principe, Gabon, Namibia, Tanzania, where we provide the ship, we provide the crew, we provide the fuel, and our government partner provides the law enforcement agents from the Navy, the Coast Guard, fisheries inspectors with the authority to actually board, inspect, and arrest ships. And what we've been able to do is assist those countries, and it's under their leadership. We're just providing the tool. These countries have been able to arrest 52 vessels for illegal fishing and other fisheries crimes since we started. And for me, each one of these vessels that's been shut down is an illegal slaughterhouse shut down. The vessels that have been arrested are largely vessels from China or from Europe. And as fish populations have gone down and collapsed in Europe and China, these distant water fleets have congregated around places like West Africa, where historically there's been an abundance of fish, but also where enforcement has been a bit of a struggle. And if you look at the European model, you've got a European fishing fleet that has a capacity that's 2.5 times what they could fish in European waters. So the European Commission goes around and signs these agreements with developing countries that are essentially cash for fish barter agreements, where they pay a certain amount of money. That's usually about 5% of what that fish is worth on the European market for licenses to fish. And because these countries don't have the domestic capacity to fish it themselves, this fish is then caught in African waters and taken back to Europe for sale. In a very literal sense, fishing illegally in waters that are reserved for artisanal fishing communities, then it is what Noam Chomsky said. It's the greedy versus the needy.
Yeah, indeed. I think it's the same for the meat as well. I mean, meat and animal agriculture in Brazil, a lot of the meat actually goes to Western countries. It doesn't really actually go to the Brazilians anyway. So it's really a disparity there, isn't it?
Right. And in West Africa, there are these big fish meal factories that are essentially buying fish from these local trawlers. These local trawlers are oftentimes fishing in areas that are reserved for artisanal fishermen. They're sometimes fishing in marine reserves, and they're offloading their fish ashore. It's being produced into fish meal. That fish meal is then being shipped from these West African countries, predominantly to China, for the pork industry, for the pig farm industry.
Going into, well, I guess, pig farm and animal agriculture, I mean, what is the impact of animal agriculture on our oceans right now?
There are huge impacts. One is fish feed. We're fishing out the oceans to feed livestock. We're fishing out the oceans to feed farmed fish, for example. So for people have sometimes thought of farmed fish as being kind of the green alternative, and that just isn't the case. Look aside from like the waste issue, where having some of these farms could have like 1 million fish, like a large farm. And so you take that amount of fish and you put them in a pristine fjord in British Columbia or a pristine fjord in Norway. It's the same as putting a pig farm in the middle of one of these fjords, the amount of waste generated. Like it just wouldn't be legal to do that. But for fish farming, it is. To produce every one farmed fish takes about 3 wild caught fish to feed them. And when there was a huge boom in aquaculture salmon in the 1990s, and this was marketed as a way to alleviate pressure from wild populations of salmon, the end result was overall just an increased demand in salmon. Like wild salmon populations continue to fall because people were buying salmon in general. So that's been a big problem. Aquaculture is a big deal. It's creating pollution that's affecting wild fish populations. You put that many fish together, they're going to have diseases. Sea lice, for example, they're going to infest populations in the wild. Some of them are going to escape their nets. And as vegans, we think maybe this is an amazing thing. And on one level, that's great for that one fish, but they're then going to breed with wild populations of salmon and destroy populations that way. So that's a big threat. You've got climate change, which is obviously the biggest problem of them all. And we're producing more carbon dioxide than the ocean can absorb. And that's why we're seeing ocean acidification. We're seeing warming oceans because of global warming. That's why we're seeing coral reefs bleaching. By 2050, there won't be any coral reefs left. A place like the Great Barrier Reef will be completely dead. And this is largely driven by animal agriculture, because animal agriculture is the single number one producer of CO2 and the biggest producer of methane gas that's resulting in these problems. So for sure, there's a link there. You've got runoff from big factory farms that's creating these hypoxic dead zones because of the amount of nitrogen they're putting into the oceans. I mean, the number of threats that are facing wild creatures, commercial fishing and illegal fishing aside, it's just astounding.
Every angle, isn't it? My goodness. And the level of damage that we're doing to the ecosystem because of what we eat and what we choose to eat. So I mean, on the other front would be plastics. I think being based in Singapore, I'm finally starting to see cafes wanting to use single-use plastic bags, pay for your plastic bags, no using of straws. We don't provide straws, but how does that pale in comparison to the plastics that are out in the sea because of this industry?
One of the biggest problems facing marine wildlife is ghost nets. Ghost nets are fishing gear that have been discarded at sea, or they've been lost at sea, or it's been net that's been entangled, so the fishing boats just cut it free and set it adrift. And these ghost nets will just continue to kill and kill and kill until they finally wash ashore somewhere. In 2017, we assisted the Liberian Coast Guard to arrest a vessel in Liberia that was using deep sea gill nets to fish for deep sea sharks. And looking into how that vessel was operating, and I should just say also that arresting that vessel has resulted in saving over 1 million sharks to date, which is just incredible, because this ship was killing 500,000 sharks a year. So that's the kind of result that Sea Shepherd can generate. The arrest of this one vessel, over 1 million sharks saved, which is unbelievable to me. But we found out that this vessel used to belong to a fleet of 50 vessels that in the 1990s carpeted the North Atlantic with deep sea gill nets, these invisible curtains of death, fishing for deep sea sharks in the North Atlantic. They were incredibly effective at what they did. In 3 years, deep sea shark populations fell to 20% their pre-fishing numbers. So ultimately, the EU kicked them out, which is why they ended up in West Africa fishing illegally. But looking at how those vessels were operating was incredible. They would go out for about 4 to 8 weeks at a time. Every month, a fleet of 50 ships, every month, each vessel would lose about 30 kilometers of gill net as drift net. Every month. So 30 kilometers of gill net times 50 ships is 1,500 kilometers of gill net. Plastic pollution that was just set adrift every single month. That's the equivalent of 750 tons of plastic pollution every month by just these 50 ships in the form of ghost net set adrift. That's just these 50 ships. So that's why it's no surprise that the real big plastic killer in the oceans is nets. But in the same way as people are against that, but they contribute to that. I wouldn't even say indirectly. They contribute to that very directly by supporting certain fishing methods. It's the same as when they buy tuna in a can, they're also killing sharks and other creatures. There's that disconnect. They have to take that extra step in thinking about their own personal responsibility. It's a lot easier to say no to a plastic straw in a shop than it is to question what you're eating every day or 3 times a day.
And yeah, you're right, because that one straw versus the thousands of kilometers, and that's just the legal fisheries, isn't it? And we've got the illegal vessels as well, isn't it?
That's right. One of the vessels that we assisted the Indonesians to arrest about 2 years ago, a ship called the STS-50, the authorities in Mozambique believed that this was a ship that had like 600 kilometers of gillnet on board. When they were finally arrested, there was no more gillnet on board their ship. So these are boats that are used to, in their modus operandi, when they're fishing illegally, they need to get rid of the evidence. The evidence is the net on board, so it just goes overboard before they get into port.
Wow.
And it's crazy because in the commercial shipping industry, there are all kinds of regulations for you can't throw plastic overboard. It's under the marine pollution regulations. You can't throw a plastic straw off the side of a cruise ship, right? But with the commercial fishing industry, you can throw tons and tons of plastic in the ocean designed to kill without really the responsibility of necessarily recovering all of it, because it's an impossibility. You're not going to recover all of your gear. And then when it finally washes ashore somewhere, predominantly in the developing world, it's up to these governments to then clean up the mess. And people are drowning in a very real sense in plastic.
Chatting with you, and it's just harrowing what's actually happening out there, and we don't actually see it, we don't feel it, because it's out of sight, out of mind. And I think sometimes for people it can feel almost too overwhelming. So with that in mind, what would you say to someone who feels like maybe their impact in the world is so insignificant, like, why bother? It's just, everything is just not going to work out anyway, and the world's kind of collapsing in on itself. What will you say to them?
I think we do ourselves a disservice sometimes in the vegan movement, and I do it all the time when we use these big numbers. I mean, it's impossible for your everyday person to even picture what does 1 trillion dead fish look like. It's impossible to even be that emotionally involved in like 300,000 whales. Like, the number's so high that it becomes abstract. I think a lot of our supporters get more excited about the fact that we saved 6,000 whales down in the Southern Ocean because we spared 6,000 times one individual from being harpooned. And we know how cruel this process is. So we need to tell a story. And I think it goes back full circle to where we started this conversation, which is one of the campaigns that I remember the most is not necessarily the most successful campaigns where we shut down an illegal trawler, and every day that trawler was stuck and detained in port, we saved tens of thousands of lives. It's pulling that individual long line out of the water. The first thing I ever did with Sea Shepherd, and knowing that this one particular hook wasn't going to kill this one particular animal that very day. So I think we have to always keep in mind the big picture of what we're trying to achieve in the long run. Like, I would love to see no animals killed, but I'm also a practical person. And I realize that I've been vegan now for 18 years, so that's something that I can do very easily. I also know that I can advocate a vegan diet to my friends and my family and anybody who will listen to me. But I'll also be willing to work together with artisanal fishing communities in West Africa, knowing that by working with them to drive these industrial trawlers out, I'm saving countless marine creatures. And maybe I then have to compromise some of my ideology because it doesn't fit this particular narrative. But at the end of the day, I think it's about listening and realizing that we have to learn, and we also have to form very broad coalitions to win. So I think what's important to do is find activism has to be sustainable. We need people to commit to a lifetime of this. Everybody has a certain skill that they're good at, something that they're also passionate about, whether it's photography or whether it's law or whether they're a seaman or whether it's in the health industry and they're a person who trains and they want to bring like that health message across. Whatever it might be, they have to find what they're good at, so that they have their passion, so that it's sustainable, and they push it from the angle that they best can, because they can do it long term. And at the end of the day, they've got to remind themselves over and over again that there are individuals that we're talking about. It's not 1 trillion fish being killed every single year. It's 1 trillion times one fish. And by remembering that, hopefully that can make a difference. I think, so much of the reason why we only see economic value in the natural world and in animals, we see only their utility, how we can use them, is because we don't have a relationship with the natural world anymore. Right. And we have to change our philosophy, and we have to remember that we are earthlings and we share this planet with so many other creatures, that we are one of millions of species, that it's not nature, humans and animals, it's nature and animals of which we are part of, and that we have to realize where we fit into the bigger picture. I think that's really helpful as well.
Thank you very, very much, Peter. And yeah, I really, really appreciate all the work that you guys do. And, along with myself, Toby, and everyone that is for the plant-based movement and the vegan movement, we're 100% behind what you guys do out in the front lines.
Well, I really appreciate everything that you and your family do using your platforms as athletes to spread the word. And I know that you reach people that I don't reach through the area that I'm working in. And together we can really make a big difference. And it can start with saying no to a plastic straw at a restaurant, but it can't end with that. And I think that's the important thing. We're all evolving as activists and advocates, and we have to keep that evolution going. And to be a part of your platform, and I'm incredibly proud to do that. And as a vegan, and having been a vegan for 18 years, I feel it feels good to be a part of that community.
Love it, Peter. I'm 10, almost a decade, so I'm 9 years behind you. So I'll catch up soon.
Well, I think you still remember when you could only buy soy milk in powdered form. And for me, it was a matter of getting in my car when I was 17 and driving for half an hour to buy powdered soy milk from like an Asian food store to be able to make my own soy milk. And now the younger vegans, they go to a supermarket and they complain when there's soy milk, oat milk, almond milk, macadamia milk, but there isn't hemp milk, and it's like the end of the world. And I'm grateful that I got to remember what it once was like. It makes me much more appreciative of what we have now. And we have that now thanks to all of these incredible people who have joined this movement. And we are a growing movement. And we should also remember our history.
Indeed, the dark days of powdered soy and tofu from the Asian grocers. Awesome. Thank you, Peter.
All right. Thank you so much, Luke.
We hope you've enjoyed this presentation. A wise man once said, "You make a new life by making new choices." Now, if you know that what you eat matters, if you know that health comes from healthy living, then the time to make new choices is now. And just imagine owning the summit for life. Click the button for more. Maybe you know our stories. Luke and I lost family to cancer, and we wish we would have known sooner what you are learning here today. So please, share the summit, take action, and let's support each other. Thank you. This is Toby and Luke signing off, and we can't wait to see you for the next presentation.